All right, the main event. Once marginalized, video games have slowly gained recognition as a legitimate form of art and culture. Grace Spee is a designer with a background in animation and computer science, and Grace is the perfect guide through the digital wilderness of typography within video games. In fact, when Grace was in grad school, she was actually banned by one of her professors for saying the words video games. Fortunately for all of us, she blew that professor right off. Okay, let's extend a warm welcome to Grace Spee. Take it away, Grace.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Grendel, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. All right. All right, you should be able to hopefully see my first slide. But yes, hi, everyone. My name is Grace Spee. I'm an assistant clinical professor of graphic design, and I do specialize in digital media and kinetic typography at the School of Design at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm so excited and just thank you so much to the Letter From Archive for inviting me to talk today about the two great passions of my life, which are typography and video games. So at first, this might seem sort of like an odd crossover, as the intersection of hardcore gamers and hardcore type nerds might feel somewhat small. And in my experience, there are actually a number of us out there, we're growing every day. Much of my design interest and research comes from games, in particular the digital community that games can provide as the third space, and also how we create and maintain our identities and our sense of self in virtual spaces. Before I get more into this, I do want to just briefly introduce my background because I actually think it has a bearing on how I approach design and these topics that I'm going to be talking about. So in school, I actually studied psychology and in particular child psychology and play therapy. I had entered a PhD program in clinical psych with the aim to be a child therapist specializing in what's called parent-child interaction therapy. And that's a sort of play therapy designed to teach parents how to positively play with your child to improve disciplinary behaviors and things like that. The concept of play has remained constant throughout my entire life. So I didn't follow through with my PhD. I ended up dropping out and swinging over to the design field. But I've always been drawn to the creativity, the freedom, and the problem solving that play, whether it's digital or physical, invites. It's this thread that connects my childhood to my present, and it continues to shape how I approach design work today. So as designers, we're trained to evaluate and work with type on, the page, the poster, the built environment. And I don't think we really consider video games to be on that same level just yet as like the page or the poster or even like the moving image for digital media. Whenever I've taken like digital media classes or talked about digital media, a lot of it's like cinema related, right? So in the book Arcade Game Typography by Toshi Amagari, and I'm going to be quoting that book several times today. It's a fantastic book. But Toshi Amagari notes the fact that typography has been largely overlooked as a defining artistic and cultural element of games. As I mentioned, in the field of specifically digital media, games have slowly begun to become recognized as more like legitimate art form of cultural expression, even if like the wider world isn't quite there yet. This is one of my favorite images to show. This is an online game with all of the like menu and UI systems turned on, and it's wild that a game can even look like this to me. This is a video game I'm playing right now. It just came out a couple days ago. But this is just one part of the menu system that lists all of the things you can attach to your character, and you can just tell that it's like this is overwhelming even for me to look at. This like huge just list of different sizes of type. This is from another online game. And this is from a website that is a guide on how to use the menu system in this video game. So it's not even a guide on how to play the game. It's a guide on how to use the menu system to play the game. And the fact that that even needs to exist is a little funny to me. But you can see from this image that so much of like the real estate of the screen and the world of the game is just taken up with like different menu systems and different like you know iconography. So you can see there's some interesting examples out there of how type has been utilized in games before. So this might seem like a silly question, but whenever I talk about this subject, I usually like to define what I mean by games a little more clearly because I found when speaking to non-gamers or even like my professors in grad school or even like my mom, when I speak about, video games as artistic or cultural icons, the idea of what a video game is tends to be a little narrow, and it might end up looking something like this. This is Halo 3 from the early 2000s. No hate to Halo 3. I played this when I was in high school, but it's a lot of like shooting and like running around. Um, but yeah, so this is what, when I say video games, this is tends to be what I think people think of. However, games, just like, books and films, they're not a homogeneous media and they're nearly impossible to define as such. Just as like we have, popcorn action flicks, we have Oscar-winning films, right? Um, they often function similarly as narrative vehicles and are just as capable of delivering incredible, heart-wrenching, and humane stories. One of the main elements that sets video games apart from their narrative counterparts is the reliance on typography in juxtaposition with visual graphics. So for a medium that's really heavily dependent on typography, it's sort of been overlooked in like the grand scheme of the development process, as well as just by the community itself, whether that community is designers or, the gaming community. Video games often allow for a degree of freedom and exploration that's not present in other media. This allows players to logically reason, feel, and sometimes, yeah, stumble and make mistakes, their way through the story or the problem that's presented in games. Games of any kind, by definition, need rules and boundaries to work properly. So video games often involve really complex sets of rules that need to be communicated to the player at any time. So that's things like health bars, inventory, scoreboards, such as this one in competitive games, um, word puzzles, notes, signage, maps, different types of user interfaces that have to communicate vast amounts of information to the player at a glance. So understanding the why of typography and the how of typography in games can facilitate a more sophisticated approach to the analysis of games as cultural records, narrative vehicles, and just as a creative medium. So a lot of people think about early video games, they automatically think of retro arcade cabinets, and that's actually about 30 years too early. We first see video games as like the concept of what a game is as early as 1940s through the 1950s. I love showcasing this one, the cathode ray tube amusement device. It sounds like some like wacky Doctor Who sci-fi thing. It was a patent granted in 1948. It never really saw the light of day. Stanford was doing experiments again as early as the 50s and the 60s. Here you can see Space War. But these are some just really early examples of the idea of something on a screen that was then controlled or had reaction input from humans through like a device or a controller. And the Stanford Space War, I guess you could call it a video game at this point, but that actually inspired the very first video game. So the true first video game, as we might recognize it today, actually premiered in 1966 by this gentleman right here, Ralph Baer, who's conventionally known as one of the two fathers of video games. So Baer developed a table tennis game playable by two people that involved moving white squares on a screen to hit a tennis ball back and forth. And you can see it in the background of that video right there. Um, I also do want to point out that even though video games have been thought of as solitary and sometimes isolating activities, the first video games that really came out were actually designed to be cooperative. They were designed to be played with a friend or a family member. Baer was able to patent his invention, eventually sold it to a company called Magnavox, which released the first ever home console, Magnavox Odyssey, in 1972. Um, Funnily enough, separate but concurrently with Baer's invention, the inventor and the other father of video games, Nolan Bushnell, developed something really similar that ran on a coin-operated arcade cabinet. So this game, Computer Space, which was heavily, heavily inspired from Stanford's Space War demonstrations, came out in 1971, and it's recognized as the first arcade game. So Bushnell actually went on to form the Atari Corporation and launched the worldwide sensation Pong, which was again, let's just say like really heavily inspired by the table tennis home console game. And you can see here, this is from what I could find, the first instance of typography in games, right? We see a very, very, very simple um, scoreboard on the side, just numbers kind of keeping track of the player's score. As I mentioned, table tennis, from the recordings that I could find of it, didn't really have any typography whatsoever. But the Magnavox Odyssey is a really interesting console. I don't have time to get into that today, but highly recommend looking up this story if anyone's interested. And we move into the 1970s and the 1980s with the population of video game arcades, and they just sort of exploded in popularity. Arcades were already in place if you think about like analog machines like claw machines and stuff. Consoles were also pretty expensive at the time. But at the arcade is where we really see this first marriage of typography and games culture. Early video games were pretty simple, and type was primarily used, as I said, for keeping score, like in Pong and in Tetris, and just conveying really simple information. Um, Over here, we have a picture of an arcade from the 1970s, and the picture on the right is actually from the arcade that I frequent in Chicago called Galloping Ghost. If you're in Chicago, I highly recommend checking it out. Pretty cool place to hang out and see all of the old arcade cabinets that they have there. But I wanted to put it in here just to kind of showcase also the design of the arcades themselves. Also, often were able to draw inspiration from the popular cabinets that were there. Um, Obviously, over in the design world, digital type was being developed just like in video games as early as the mid 1960s. A lot of times we see, technology sort of develops in lockstep with each other. Um, though we saw these fonts, digital fonts being established by foundries like Emigre, as there was still this disconnect between type and the games industry. As in, most designers didn't really seem to want to have to do a lot with video games. Our first typography comes from not necessarily even typographers or designers or even the artists themselves. Sometimes it came from the developers who, by necessity, became these like accidental typographers. At the time, no one from the design industry really wanted to get involved in working on video games. They were kind of seen as this like, no one was really sure if games were going to be sticking around. It was almost seen as like a passing fad in a way. And so actually a lot of early game history is kind of lost. There's a lot of lost media. And I think a lot of the early artwork too is lost as well. I'm going to mention again another shout out to this book, Arcade Game Typography, but Toshi Omagari really says it best. Limitation is a great driver of creativity, as is technological innocence. The lack of commercial interest in and influence from the computer type industry resulted in a collection of beautiful art created by outsiders. So, our concept of pixel typography, as we call it today, which is entirely almost associated with video games or early internet culture or even that sense of nostalgia, right? Comes from these outsiders. We owe this entire cultural movement and then as well as the independent game scene, which really has exploded in popularity over the last couple of years. And I'll get to that later in the presentation. But we owe all of that to these early pioneers who recognized the importance of type for their creations, and yet were pretty limited to this small 8x8 grid. Which made for some pretty wonky but ultimately really beautiful typography. And that's something that we're seeing sort of like a renaissance in the independent games community today. So I have to highlight this first font, which is colloquially called the Atari font, even though it has no official name. But it pops up super frequently in these early arcade games from Namco and Atari. And it was made most famous, I believe, through this original Pac-Man game. And it was thought to be the work of Lyle Rain, who, again, not a typographer, but a developer and a senior executive at Atari. And it spread sort of to these other Japanese game developers. And we see its influence in a number of different types from this era. Um, a lot of times again people were not sure how long video games were going to last, and so I think things sort of just got packaged and like passed around and copied and shared quite frequently. um, I have to mention Super Mario Bros. So Super Mario Bros. First premiered by Nintendo in 1985. Um, the logo was created in-house by the development team. I wasn't able to find more information on it. People think that it might have been, that It might have been developed by Shigeru Miyamoto, who was the director and creator of Super Mario Bros. At the time, and he had a big hand in a lot of the game's development, sort of sketched some of the characters. But you'll see here the type is pretty simple. It's again, it's relegated to like a corner of the screen. It's again primarily used for keeping score. We see the it's how many coins do you have, how much time has progressed, and we start to see a little bit of. Let me play this clip again. We start to see little bits of like animation as Mario is sort of like running around and like hitting the enemies. You get like the little pops of typography, but again, it's all very like numbers based. Now, I have to mention Skyfox. So, Skyfox is a fixed shooter, setting the player in the role of a space pilot fighting against these female alien invaders and space monsters under their control. This game isn't particularly groundbreaking or I would say like necessarily important. It was part of, this huge myriad of arcade cabinet games that were sweeping the nation at the time. But I have to showcase this one because it's my favorite entry in arcade game typography because the type to me is so odd. The developers of this futuristic sci-fi space shooter somehow thought that the font that should best represent the genre and the tone of their game would be this overly ornate round hand script. Even with the limited capabilities of the 8-bit graphics, you can see here like script in pixel type is extremely challenging. And even better, it's all capitalized. I don't know why, but it's one of my favorite things. It's my favorite entry in the book. I had to highlight it because it's so funny to me. Um, I do think so. One of the things you can see here is that the alien invaders are scantily clad women, sex cells. So I wonder if that had something to do with it. This very like curvy, flowy font maybe was more in line with that tone of the game versus like the sci-fi-ness of it all. But again, even the numbers are sort of very curvy and script-like. But yeah, it's I think it's a weirdly beautiful font either way. Street Fighter 2 came out in the 90s. And so the 90s was really a turning point for the gaming industry. And I'll get into that in just a little bit, but I wanted to finish up sort of our 2D games by talking about Street Fighter. So Street Fighter 2 World Warrior is hailed as one of the greatest and most influential games of all time. It helped boost the declining business of arcade games, which as we sort of transition in the 90s, we see the rise of home consoles and personal computers, and so arcades were starting to struggle just a little bit. It also really promoted human-to-human gaming competitions. I mentioned earlier that gaming starts as something that's cooperative, and Street Fighter started a lot of local and sort of like grassroots tournaments, which functions as a precursor to our esports scene today, which not super popular in America, but is worldwide gaining traction. Um, but this has now turned into like multiple international competitions that are like generate millions and millions of dollars and like fans worldwide. Um, but so as you'll be able to see in the recording in just a little bit, type in Street Fighter, much like its predecessors, is going to be largely relegated to the top of the screen, again, used for keeping score and also monitoring the health of the fighters. We do start to see some letter forms as part of background settings in some of the fights. The title of the game is World Warrior, so you can travel sort of around the world fighting. Um, but one of the other things that I want to point out is this use of text here to help establish the identity of the characters themselves. So games at the time weren't really producing long animated cutscenes that we might be familiar with today. And Street Fighter would use these text cut-ins, and it kind of reminds me of like 1920s silent movies to help establish the narrative tone of the game. And I think that this is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, I should say, that Street Fighter characters have become so beloved by many in the gaming community is due to this attempt at storytelling, in addition to its, very revolutionary gameplay. So Street Fighter, the body text is set in this pixel font, and you can tell it's like sometimes some of the letters are a little funky, a little unreadable. It was created by an unknown developer at Capcom, and it's been reused in many of their games from the early 80s or from the 80s and the 90s. And you can see here as the text is kind of going, It's definitely broken up in some funky ways, and whether that's because they didn't have a designer to, properly set it, or whether that's a limitation of the machine itself, probably both is my guess. Um, yeah, we also see here we go. Um, the title mark is this dynamic, red to yellow brush-like gradient type. It gives this feeling of like a closed fist sort of sailing right past your face. The coloring and the angle to me is largely reminiscent of the 1980s martial arts movie boom that was happening, which likely influenced Street Fighter. Yeah, so I mentioned that the 90s was a pretty big turning point for video games. And that's because we see this transition from 2D based video games to more immersive three-dimensional environments and gameplay. So in tandem, game developers begin to shift from more linear gameplay, which is telling the player exactly what to do and where to go, to games where the player has some degree of control, and really has to take initiative in exploring the world of the game. And you could argue that this makes type even more important once games embrace this open world, because you have a degree of freedom that had previously been unfounded in other games and even other types of media. And so you see here we've got 10 years between these two Mario games, right? The one that I've already showed from 1985, Super Mario 64 in 1996. Look at the difference between this. First of all, we've got animated cutscenes already. We've got type in those animated cutscenes that are helping establish the tone and the world setting. Um, Earlier in that clip, we have three-dimensional typography, right? That's not something that we had had up until this point. So there's a pretty big leap forward in that time period frame. So at this point, I tend to categorize the use of type in two categories, and they're not necessarily separate or distinct from one another. A lot of times, games really cleverly intertwine these two categories, I think. I look at it as overworld and in-world type. So overworld type might include things that like UI and menu design, which can typically seen as being separate from the world of the game. It's not necessarily something that the character that you're playing as is seeing, right? This include things like health, magic, and stamina meters, damage numbers for enemies and allies, overworld directions, button inputs, etc. In-world type is typography that emphasizes the world building and the storytelling. So this might helps fully immerse the player in the world of the game. So this might be things like in-game posters, advertisements, identities for fictional companies or organizations in the game, street signs, notes, newspapers, puzzles, maps, etc. The first game I want to highlight from this time period is a game called Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines from 2004. So this was a mildly popular game. It's a little bit niche, I would say, but it's a role-playing game where you guide a newly turned vampire through Los Angeles. And so where this game differs from other games in its class at the time is that in the early 2000s, is that the typography in the text boxes with the non-playable characters, and you can see that right here. The type was designed to accommodate and accompany some of the more unique gameplay mechanics, that being freedom of choice and non-linear game design. There's many ways to accomplish the quest objective in this game, and it's defined by the type of character you've chosen to play. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at this. The difference in the type color and the font choice is meant to represent the differences in gameplay here. So for example, if you look at this number one, which is this like nearly unreadable bright red type, it says nothing matters, give me the astral light. Okay, it's something that has to do with something in the game. But it's this jagged, viciously red horror movie-esque font, right? And it's meant to be the choice that if you pick that, you are going to fight the character you are speaking to. So you are picking it as the aggressive choice. Number three, the I heard your name on the midnight wind with the letter form sort of flowing this way and that, is actually the choice that you might pick if you were role playing as an insane vampire. So yes, there is a choice in this game that you can role play as a vampire that's losing its mind. In this example right here, we can see that there's three, regular options that will advance the story, but number two in this pink, flowery script, this frightening isn't the word I'd use, exciting is more like it, is the seduction mechanic or the persuasion mechanic. It's the mechanic or it's the option you would pick if you wanted to romance that character. And you can see, there's some questionable typesetting things. The numbers are different sizes. The colors are definitely a choice. The line spacing is all sorts of funky. But the fact that the developers wanted to communicate to the player that the choices that they are making in the dialogue actually had, wildly different outcomes and that they wanted to do that through typography is really, really unique at this time. Um, BioShock in 2007, so a couple years after Vampire, the game I just spoke about, is a first-person shooter set in the 1960s. It follows the protagonist Jack, who discovers the underwater city of Rapture, which is built to be this isolated utopia that has since fallen to dystopian ruin. So right at the start of the game, you're greeted with the title of the game in the Century Gothic bold, and it's extremely architectural, dimensional, beautiful treatment, right? And it's really a preview or a clue that the most important character that you're going to meet is BioShock is actually the city of Rapture itself. Now, BioShock is largely lauded as one of the greatest commercial games of all time for its dystopian and utopian themes. It borrows a lot of ideas from like Ayn Rand, George Orwell, other philosophers at the time. It's regarded as one of the first games to break into mainstream media or pop culture discourse that video games can be art. Now, the typography treatment in BioShock is varied and it's incredibly beautiful, but it has an intent beyond that. It really drives home the identity of this virtual space. So when I was in grad school, one of our assigned readings, and you're probably, I always get a couple like laughs or like good-natured eye rolls when I bring this up, but I promise it has a point. So one of the text that we were assigned to read was Learning from Las Vegas. And Learning from Las Vegas is one of the seminal texts about the identity of place. And in it, the authors declare that the sign is more important than the architecture and that the new paradigm for architecture is communication over space. So obviously, Venturi wasn't thinking about video games when he published this in the 1970s. But when I read this in grad school, I like could not stop thinking about BioShock because I think that what they're saying here is really critical when you're contemplating cities in virtual spaces. Due to technological limitations of game engines and console hardware in 2007, a lot of developers and level designers, they couldn't just make this entire city, right? There were open world games soon to come out at the time, but in this game in particular, they're relegated to a few levels to represent a very large city. So rather than build out a much larger space for the player to like physically roam around in, we're given more compact levels that are absolutely jam-packed with visual signals and clues that give the illusion of a much larger space. Not only does the signage serve as this beautiful visual introduction to the city, but it reinforces that political and socioeconomic narrative of the fall of Rapture from this proposed libertarian utopia to this nightmarish dystopia. The content of the signs offer this glitzy, glamorous view of the city. So we see entertainment districts, luxury shops, fine art galleries, cocktail lounges. The signs showcase a society driven by consumerism and hedonism. And as you, as a player, delves deeper into the ruins of Rapture, the signs remain unchanged, right? Yes, they're starting, maybe they start to fall or they're covered in blood, but they're still bright and alluring. And it really takes on this bittersweet taste. It's a reminder of how great the city could have been as the player pieces together the mystery of what has happened. The next game I'm going to highlight before I move into sort of our next turning point in gaming history, it's a game called Splinter Cell. And so I have to admit, I sort of wrote this game off as like a popcorn flick type of video game where you're just like running around shooting things. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not necessarily the type of game that I like to play. So I admit I wrote this off at first, but Splinter Cell is a spin-off of the highly popular Tom Clancy novel series. You play as a secret agent and you run around doing a lot of like black ops type of stuff for the NSA. What caught my attention about this game, though, is it's one of the first like commercial popular games of its genre to fully integrate directives to the player in the environment and the world of the game itself. So rather than just simply like, again, that overworld type that sits on top of the game's UI or showing up in like a checklist, the type attaches itself to real world objects like buildings, walls, crates, etc. And you can see here in this clip, the color palette of the world is largely muted. Some sections even seem to be like grayscale a little bit. It makes the type all that more prominent. And the type appears like it's projected from white light and it kind of reminds me of like the bat signal, right? It beautifully showcases the materiality of the objects underneath. So even right here in this clip, you can see the graffiti underneath. You can see the slats of the door underneath the type. At times when you're playing this game, you sort of have to like manipulate the camera to even see because the words are big, right? They're building sized, and it really forces the player to have a deeper interaction with the world that's being created by the game and an appreciation for the details that are making up the game environments. This is when we're making a lot of like strides forward as far as like realism goes. Like this game looks pretty good even in 2025 standards. So not only does the game use type to give direction to the player, but it also indicates the mental state of the character being controlled by the player. So at one point, sorry, this is going to be a spoiler, but at one point, you find out that the organization you're working for has betrayed you and been manipulating you. So type starts flashing and like flying around the character in this like 2.5D space, and it really echoes the anxiety and the mental breakdown and the racing thoughts that the character begins to have as he learns about this betrayal. And so in a fit of anger, Sam here begins to like destroy objects and lash out, and you see words like guilt and burden and danger are sort of being like projected across and revealed in the wreckage. Um, like I said, this type of game didn't have this type of typography at the time, and I've not really seen another game like this again. I just think it's really such a unique way of handling that. So as we move into the 2010s, we start to see another turning point, and that's really the rise of the independent game. Indie games have been around, since the 80s, but in the 2010s, 2000s, we see the technical, economic, and social changes help lower the barrier to game development, and it makes these home-brewed or small studio games much less expensive to make and distribute. And not only that, the internet and social media help make smaller studio and single developer games much more visible. Now, these independent games start offering non-traditional gameplay from what we're seeing in commercial mainstream games. Everything I've been showing up until this point has generally been considered either what's called a AA or a AAA game. Those are the big commercial games made from studios that make a lot of money and they also cost a lot of money. And they're generally published by big studios like Nintendo or big publishers like Nintendo and PlayStation, etc. Um, but independent games are made often by artists, people who aren't necessarily programmers. But the game development becomes accessible to a whole new generation of artists who grew up alongside the game industry and really has been watching it blossom over, the course of the last couple of years. So the first game that I want to highlight from this is a game called Device 6, and it's from a Swedish duo named Simigo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a mashup of their two names, this Swedish duo. And I believe one handles the art and the graphics, and the other handles more of the technical aspects. But Device 6 is an independent game for mobile devices, so it's made for tablets and for phones. It's what's known as a visual novel puzzle game. You follow the story of Anna, who wakes up in a strange castle with no memory of who she is or how she came to be there. And so here is a sample of the gameplay. And you might look at this and be like, Grace, this is literally just like a Kindle. What are you talking about? But Device 6 is really unique in its approach to typography. Many visual novel games before and since have these really beautiful illustrated panels where you see, the art on the screen, and then all of the text that the characters are either saying or what's describing what's going on is sort of relegated to the bottom of the screen. And we saw that in Vampire: The Bloodline Masquerade, right? It's sort of relegated to like a box at the bottom. Device 6 forgoes all of that, any intricate illustration, in favor of a minimalist style with this typography focused approach. So the story unfolds as a living novel on your phone screen, with the type sort of shifting and colliding upon itself in response to what the protagonist is experiencing. So Anna's inner monologue exists in light gray italics around the edge of the screen, which really frames that main story. As the player reads the text by sort of swiping through different screen, portions of text might appear around corners, and it really encourages the player to move in that direction. And that sort of emulates the exploration of of the castle that you're going alongside Anna. What Remains of Edith Finch is a first-person exploration mystery game. So this is again a couple years later in 2017. And this game is what's known as a walking simulator. So the story follows 17-year-old Edith Finch, who is the last surviving member of her large family as she returns to her ancestral home for the first time in several years. The narrative structure of this game leans into magical realism, and players begin to see that Edith is not necessarily a reliable narrator. The game developers utilize type to underscore all of these themes. So walking simulators tend to have a bad reputation in gaming circles as being, they're called boring, they're called like basically they're called movies, which is really funny. It's used as an insult. But the biggest complaint is that there's no actual gameplay mechanics, that you're sort of just like walking around from one place to the other. It's not the case in Edith Finch, which has a wild amount of different gameplay mechanics. So just as in design, when we establish a strong and concise visual language when we work on a project, games too develop a sort of gameplay language or functions when it comes to mechanics. Rather than engaging in the same types of mechanical gameplay loops, this game asks something different of its players in each of its narrative chapters. And all of this is guided by the really strong typography. And you can see that kind of right here. Edith Finch uses type in really interesting ways. Edith's voice occurs as text in various ways. So sometimes it's floating, sometimes it's fixed to objects, like it's fixed to this chair right here. Sometimes it's obscured by other objects as Edith moves through the house, reliving the tragic memories of her family's demise. So text will break apart, unravel, get swept away, or even sometimes implode. As Edith explores her family home, each member of her family has their own dedicated font to further illustrate their personalities, hopes, dreams, and ultimately their tragic deaths. You can see the magical realism sort of coming into play right here. In the interest of time, I am going to skip this slide just so I can get through some more things I have for you guys. The last independent game I want to speak about before I move on to our final section is Disco Elysium. And so I like to call this game the indie darling of all indie games. You take on the role of an alcoholic and drug-addicted amnesiac detective who's been tasked with solving a murder mystery. It's set in a version or a place that's heavily inspired by Eastern Europe. And it deals heavily in political and economic ideologies of communism, fascism, moralism, and ultra-liberalism. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy game. However, unlike other games that I've featured so far that also prominently feature the inner thoughts of the protagonist, the type in the text in Disco Elysium isn't fully integrated in the world of the game. It overlays it as this constant stream of text. So the Zon team and Robert Kurvitz, who created the game, have come out in interviews talking about how they didn't have, they had very talented artists as part of this project, but they didn't actually have a dedicated graphic or designer or a UI designer. So they came up with the idea themselves to design the UI to reflect that of the social media feed, similar to, Twitter, basically, or comments in a subreddit. It's a pretty novel break from how other visual novels or text-heavy games handle their type. I've already mentioned, that typically gets relegated to the bottom of the screen. The UI and the text is based upon how we doom scroll through social media feeds, right? The type scrolls up to reveal itself and the dialogue choices. The developers wanted to reflect that quick and snappy nature of a feed, as well as the confrontational nature that can frequently occur in internet spaces. A lot of this game is you arguing with inanimate objects or with parts of yourself. So right here in this clip, you can see that you are arguing with your mirror, or I should say, engaging in a conversation with your mirror that sometimes turns confrontational. Sometimes you're arguing with like your limbic system or other parts of your body. Your tongue, for example. It's an extremely odd game in some ways. The title mark here is Dobra Black, and at first it's this blocky, but ultimately has some soft areas to it. And I like looking at this because you can see that the terminals of the S and the C both narrow just a touch, and the spine of like the S stays pretty thick throughout. And it leads itself to this kind of like off-kilter feeling of a type, and it mirrors to me many of the ways that they deal with major themes throughout this game. So obviously, I mentioned there's already a lot of heavy political and socioeconomic ideologies in this game, and a lot of times it treats it with this kind of like fatalist or nihilistic humor. I think that's really well reflected in the way they've done the title mark here. For the majority of the actual text of the game, it looks like the developers chose this more literary inspired font due to the sheer amount of type in this game. So the lead writer of this game has stated that the game itself is comprised of 1.2 million words. Okay, that's pretty hefty. For comparison, I believe the Bible is around 700,000 words. I've also seen this compared as all three Lord of the Rings books plus The Hobbit times two. Like that's how much text is in this game. It is a huge reading load. Um, but yes, the serif font that we saw earlier, I believe it's Sina Nova. It possesses these really softer serifs and this higher X height, and it really helps legibility at smaller sizes. So even though they didn't have a maybe a developer and things like that, or a designer I should say, they clearly did some research when it came to typography. And leading into that, in 2022, as part of the initiative for this push for accessibility in gaming, the developers decided to add the option to change the game's type to Open Dyslexic, which is the font that's been designed to help mitigate some of the reading errors for those with dyslexia. So Open Dyslexic, you can see here, has this heavier visual weight near the bottom of the characters, and it's meant to help uh, dyslexic readers indicate direction and prevent that flipping or swapping. Now, I was in psychology. I'm a huge believer in evidence-based research. The research studies on dyslexia-friendly fonts have thus far proven somewhat inconclusive. Um, However, anecdotal evidence from various online forums suggests that they're helpful to at least some people. If you go on like Reddit or Steam forums or like any number of online places, you'll find at least one person who said, "I don't know, it helped me." And I think, if it helped at least a couple people, that's something worth noting. And so that moves into our final section, which is where we are at with gaming nowadays. As we move into the 2020s, I think that we see gaming technology feels like it's plateaued a little bit in the sense that we're no longer making these huge, giant technical leaps forward in terms of graphic realism, right? We're seeing lots of little improvements over time. Developers are able to make the game worlds larger and larger with like less loading screens and like less lag. And with that, I've noticed a trend in this sort of design. This minimalism versus maximalism. Now, certain developers seem to be focusing on how real can we make our game? How fully can we immerse the player in the world of our game? So elements like the menu, the map, any sort of overworld type become stripped away as bare bones as possible. If you're familiar with the HBO show The Last of Us, this is a picture from The Last of Us 2, which came out in 2020. And this is the opening of the game. And I love this because it's such a power move to not even put the title of your game in the opening menu, right? I love that. It's cold, it's isolating, it perfectly reflects what happens in that game. You only have the option to start your story, options to change settings, and that's pretty much it, right? It doesn't even tell you what game you're playing. Super, super minimalist. On the other hand, though, we also see some developers start to embrace trends that were started more by the indie games in the 2010s by embracing that menu and typographic system design as full players in the art and the narrative of their game. And that's the games that are really exciting to me nowadays. Um, so the first game I want to talk about in this concept or in this area is Persona 5. Now, Persona 5 is a Japanese role-playing video game originally based on Jungian psychology, where the player takes on the role of a high school student who lives out a single year while attending school in modern-day Tokyo. The game has two distinct gameplay elements. So there's a social simulator in which the player has to, yes, attend high school, form friendships, and literally like take tests and participate in club activities. And you might be thinking, Grace, why would I ever play this? I never want to relive high school again. Well, the other part of the game is a dungeon crawler where the player has to battle monsters called shadows, which are the physical manifestations of suppressed human psyches. Now, Persona is a pretty long-running series. Dates back all the way to like the 80s and the 90s. But outside of a pretty small niche audience, it was virtually unknown to like outside of Japan. The development team with Persona 5, they really wanted every part of the game to help attract a larger mainstream international audience. So, with that goal, they turned their attention to creating this really beautiful UI and system, complete with really special attention to typography, or rather, how far they could break the rules of type while still achieving the end result of having that menu and words communicate information to the player. Now, before I showcase the UI system in detail, I have to say this is the only video game that I've noticed non-designers and like, your average gaming community actually say, wow, look at that typography, to the point where it was became a trend to cosplay or to dress up as the menu system. And I have witnessed this in person because that's me right there. I used to run fan convention or not fan conventions, but I used to run panels at like gaming and anime conventions, and I would dress up as the characters. I got to interact with the voice actors from Persona 5. It was really exciting. But I've actually seen people do this in person. And I can just say, like, the excitement I got when I saw people want to cosplay typography was really, really fun. Um, so, Persona 5 is a game about breaking unjust or harsh rules imposed by society, and the narrative itself is based on themes of pop punk. So, pop punk being both mass oriented and anti establishment. I mean, who doesn't love like raging against the machine, especially when you're in high school, right? So the punk part of the pop punk inspirations are pretty, I think, clearly apparent in the characterizations and the type treatment of the English language menu, which is very, very similar to what the Japanese language menu looks like. But it clearly draws upon, the punk fanzines from the 1980s, like Maximum Rock and Roll, Profane Existence. You see these like mismatching letter forms, the random assortment of slab, serif, and non-serif characters that still somehow feel like they fit together really well, right? This purposefully mismatched was done really carefully. You see counters that don't fit in their letter forms, like they're trying to break free of their own letter form. Letters are knocking into each other. It communicates in the most skillful and respectful way possible. Damn you and damn your typographic rules. There's no grid or baseline really to be found in anywhere in Persona 5. Um, Here's a close-up of the battle system, and you can see there's like type veritably shooting out of the player character, right? So this is when you're battling a monster, these are the options that you have in the game of things you can do. And the type is like right there with you. It's very, very active. It's very dynamic. It's overwhelming, but it somehow still immerses you fully in the world of the game. And that's why you don't have to strip away menu elements to have an engaging immersive game. This is doing it with typography well in hand. Danganronpa 3 is a game that came out roughly the same time as Persona 5 from 2017. It's another a Japanese game. It's a dark visual novel mystery where high school students are trapped in high school by a robotic teddy bear and they're forced to murder each other to escape. It's very like Hunger Games Battle Royale, right? Um, the core gameplay revolves around what's called class trials. And so these are text-based debate mini games that simulate chaotic, high-energy arguments of a courtroom. You can see here, it is frenzied, right? There's no action gameplay. Everything's driven by these stylized animated text that sort of spin, stretch, and clashes. The nonstop debate font, which is the type that you're seeing right here, is colophon bold. The excessive simplicity and the robust legibility is a definite necessity for how the type is treated in this gameplay, right? It's moving, it's active, it's spinning around, it's sometimes hard to read. Um, Even when the type is spinning, it remains incredibly legible, which is pretty crucial as one of the mini games that you just saw right here requires the player to use other type called truth bullets to shoot down inaccurate statements made by classmates during the trial. I'm This is the title mark. There's been some debate about like what the title mark of Danganronpa actually is. I believe it might be this typeface or a modification, I should say, of this typeface serpentine from the 1970s. This is an old scanned copy of Industrial Arts Methods from 1972. It's been described as by the designer as contemporary and easily adaptable to any number of circumstances, which I find really funny because when I look at this, I instantly see just like 1970s industrial, right? Um, Very like science fictiony, which definitely fits with Danganronpa. Changes in the font are used to emphasize a character's state of mind, such as this, in just a minute, you'll see here, this unnervingly wavy serif, which is called Comic Mystery DB for an anxious character, or to announce changes in gameplay. Danganronpa has probably the most amount of fonts that I've ever seen in a video game ever. It's to the point where it's like almost overwhelming. This is my second to last one, so I'm almost at, I hope I'm doing okay on time. So Control is an action adventure game, came out in 2019 that centers on Jesse Faden, who investigates the mysterious Federal Bureau of Control, which is a secret U.S. government agency studying supernatural phenomena. So inspired by internet urban legends and the genre of the new weird, the game unfolds entirely within this like brutalist office building. So this brutalist aesthetic shapes not only the architecture and the, art style of the game, but also the typography, which leans into this like very minimal, very pragmatic sans serif. Um, the most striking typographic moments, though, come when you enter a new area. You get these massive avant-garde Gothic letter forms that just dominate the screen with super tight kerning, really, really bold weight. And it really echoes the oppressive structure of brutalism. And you can see right here, even this, when I was playing and recording this jump scared me. Like I wasn't expecting these like big letter forms to pop up when I crossed into that area. Um, so I had recognized, this typeface before, but I didn't know much about it. So when I was reading up on it, it was published in the 1970s, or it came out in the 1970s. The inspiration came for the logo from Avant-Garde magazine in the 1960s, which is really funny because this magazine ironically embodies the exact opposite of office culture. It was often featuring like erotic content and radical politics. Um, so you can see avant-garde in the title word mark here again with like extremely tight kerning, very reminiscent of like those blocky brutalist forms. The typography and control conveys authority and constraint, which really reinforces the Bureau's rigid control amidst chaos. Even in environmental graphics, so you see these all over the game, these posters, memos, and notices, the game mimics real life office drabness. So these are a close-up of some of the posters that you can see featured prominently throughout the game environment. And some of the designs are a little bit awkward. There's like odd weights and some grammar mistakes. And at first I was like, is this an oversight? And then I realized like ultimately that deepens the world building. It reminded me of these like posters that I would see whenever I would work in like offices. They would have these like inspirational posters, right? And I used to work in an office that had one of these, and it had a spelling mistake right on the poster itself. And I would look at it every day, and I'm like, why is this still hanging here? But that's what it reminds me of. The strange made ordinary, and the ordinary made just strange enough to feel very, very off. All right, this is the last game I'm going to be featuring. It came out just a couple of months ago. It's called Lorelei and the Laser Eyes. It actually is an indie game. It's from the same duo that brought us Device 6. It's a mystery puzzle game, and players explore an old hotel to figure out what's happening, while the world becomes progressively more dangerous and surreal around you. So the game features more than 150 interconnected puzzles, so it definitely is a puzzle-based game. And these can be completed in any order, and as you complete puzzles, you unlock more of the world around you. So I sent this picture to my gaming group when I started this game, thinking I was in for this like fun puzzle afternoon jaunt. By the end of the game, I was about 20 pages deep in conspiracy theories, frazzled notes, lost sleep, and failed math equation. And yes, there's a lot of math in this game, but I was really feeling like a crazy person. The developers themselves have noted that they paid special attention to the fonts in this game just due to the sheer amount of puzzles and documents in Lorelei and the Laser Eyes. So there's several places that you might end up playing like a game within a game within a game, and the type shifts and changes to reflect that. The developers have described this game as walking through a collection of memories. It's also the only game to date that has puzzles that revolve completely around typefaces, as in you have to pay attention to and complete parts of words based on what typefaces the words are set in. And that's what you're seeing right here on screen. When I realized there were puzzles dedicated entirely to noticing and paying attention to the differences in letter form design, I lost my mind. I was so excited, and I was like, I have to talk about this game to someone. Um, when you look up this game online, first of all, there's a lot of people who need help with the puzzles. They're pretty difficult, if I do say so myself. But you'll see here, you'll find things like, weird fonts, part 11 font. And even then, hints for things I'm stuck on. One of the number one clues here is think typefaces. What a great thing that we've come so far that typefaces are now the answer to some puzzles in some games. And I just think that's really beautiful. Well, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. And if you've seen this presentation and you think, wow, typefaces are actually like super, games are super cool, but where do I even start? I'm not a gamer. I would like to present you with Typewriter. So Typewriter is an educational game that teaches the history of typography through puzzles and platforming challenges. You play as the most adorable little colon that I've like ever seen in my life. And you go through typographic history. And it's a platformer. So here's like the Gothic section, for example. But it's a platformer that as you move through different letter forms, you collect letter forms of that genre, and you get to learn more about like the history and the design of the letter forms. And I just think that's so neat. This game is about $2. You can play it on multiple systems. I think you can play it on MacBooks even, which is definitely an achievement. Um, but I always recommend this game to my students. I can't require them to play it because it does cost money and I feel bad, but it's so fun for like students to play or even just typographers to play who want like a really simple game to get into. And that's everything I have for you today. I will stop sharing, but thank you all so much. That's
Oh
it.
my God. Grace, that was amazing. Jesus
Thank you.
Christ. I even
Thank
want to get video games now. I mean, that's how good it was. All right,
you. No,
people,
thank you.
it's Q&A time. So get those questions in the Q&A for Grace. And I'm going to type the answers in. And if we get a lot of questions, we're going to have to upvote the ones that you want to see
Oh
answered.
my gosh.
Okay?
So should I look at the Q&A and start answering?
You can, I'm going to read the questions out loud and
Oh,
then you can answer them, but you can also look at it if you want,
okay,
if that
perfect.
helps. So we have a question from Laime, who is a TypeQuest graduate, by the way. Laime asks, how do you see the role of display typefaces evolving in the future of game design, particularly beyond their traditional use in title marks?
That's such a great question. Oh my gosh. So you see, like I sort of split this presentation up into two parts, right? Because I was talking about the font that the body copy that's actually used in game and the title marks that are usually modified, by the designer or whoever created it. And I guess it sort of depends on what topic or what time period of game you're also talking about. Um, but I think that the as we understand typography more and more in three-dimensional spaces, I didn't even have time today to talk about type in VR or AR, which is, again, deserves its own presentation. And I've done a lot of work in like augmented and virtual reality, and type there is like the Wild West, right? Like we are still understanding what that looks like. But as we evolve and as we understand how type fits into these three-dimensional environments, I think we're going to see, I hope we see more use of display typefaces in video games and just more creative. Like, I think Persona 5, that game I showed, and also Persona 5 is on my shirt right now. I had to rep it. It's like one of my favorite games. But I think Persona 5 is a great example of how you can use really, really um, like high personality typefaces beyond just that of title marks, right? So even Danganronpa, right, the game talked about after that, had it had that like super heavy legible, font, but it also had like a brushstroke font and like that like wavy type of font. And there was a lot more that I didn't even get to show. But I hope we see more that sort of display typefaces more integrated in the world of video games versus just as the title mark. Yeah, so that's kind of where I think it's going.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Ben Z has a question. Ben is also a TypeQuest graduate. Ben asks, curious how much we know, if anything, about the people slash developers and designers at game studios who
Yeah.
worry about the type choices in games. Are there often custom typefaces used in contemporary games? If so, are they in-house designs or are they working alongside broader branding concerns?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So, actually, when I did a somewhat a similar presentation at TypeCon a couple years ago, and I had met some people who had done type work in video games, and so I got a chance to speak to some of them, and they had approached it much like, a lot of other of their like branding projects. And they actually like they came up and they showed me, they're like, yeah, have you heard of like Dota? Have you heard of this game? Like, I did some of the type work for that. I was like, oh my gosh. And so like I was super excited to sit down and talk to them. And it was really funny because the impression that I got was like this was just like another project for them. And so I think that they're and I don't think the person I was speaking to was necessarily like a video game player. Um, and I'm curious if as, gaming just becomes bigger and bigger, we're going to start to see designers who are avid game players, much like, the developers who make video games, a lot of them are avid game players, right? And you can see that whenever they talk about their video games in like the award ceremonies and stuff like that. But I think we're going to start to see more this, the integration is happening, right? Um, so kind of to get, sorry, I'm getting a little off topic with your question. Um, are there often custom typefaces used in contemporary video games? Yes and no. I think that a lot of the ones I showed here, especially some of the later ones, are typefaces that were found or licensed. Um, are they in-house designs or are they working alongside broader branding concerns? I think the answer is both. Again, um, uh, a lot of times, like again, the title marks are more custom made, which I think we saw a number of times. Um, but like again, I'm going to harken back to Persona 5. I believe that that one was developed very specifically for Persona 5, sort of like a conglomerate of different typefaces that were very carefully done by the designer working with the director of the game. Um, and that game has won a number of like awards based in Japan on for the art style of their game. And so I had to kind of like go through and like translate some of their like acceptance speeches and things like that to learn more about like how they had designed their game. But that's I think a good one to look at for that question.
All right. Yeah, Ben, what are you angling for a job designing video game type, huh? Could be fun, right? Oh my
Yeah.
God. Could be way fun. Okay, let's see. Diane asks, and thank you. Keep those questions coming. We have up to 1:30, by the way, so we can ask more. Diane says, for a type designer with a very strong interest in video games, how would you approach getting into the industry?
That's a
Ah,
great question. And if anyone knows, please let me know also. Because I feel like I've sort of been on the outside of it. Chicago isn't like a very we have some indie game developers here, and I know some people who work in the game industry, but we're by and large not like a gaming hub. Um, so if anyone knows, I would love to know also. I think a lot of it seems from the research I've been able to do, it just seems that you work at a studio that gets hired or you're part of the art department. that gets hired by the studio itself. I will say, one of the games I didn't get to mention today, just in the interest of time, there's a game called Cyberpunk 2077 by a studio in Poland called CD Projekt Red. And that studio actually, for that game, hired a whole host of graphic designers just to make all of the branding and create the identity of the companies that feature in that game. So it's a cyberpunk game, so there's a lot of like mega corporations and like street gangs and different organizations of like people in that game. And I remember coming across that job advertisement when I was in grad school, and I was still in grad school at the time, so like I couldn't apply for it, but I wished I could have, because that would be like the dream job, right? Like creating things for video games, I just think is so cool. But so I would just say keep an eye on like different game developers and the jobs, because they will look for like graphic artists, and a lot of times those are more focused on like animation and things, but they do look for graphic designers. So yeah.
All right. Oh my God. Wouldn't that be an amazing
I
job
would
though?
love,
That
yeah.
sounds crazy.
Yeah,
What
I
did
don't
you
want to
say?
leave my current job. I love
Yeah.
working at UIC, but I do think that that would be a really, really fun thing to do.
What did you say that game was? Cyberpunk. What was the numbers? I want to make sure
Oh,
I
Cyberpunk 2077.
2077. Okay. Glad I asked. All right. Let's see. What do we got? Ivan Golkov asks, in the history portion, I noticed you skipped the Infocom
I'm
era,
so sorry. I'm
late
sorry.
70s, early 80s, of text adventures with their amazing feelies. A lot of great typography in those.
You know, and I
Well,
couldn't agree more. And I'm so sorry. I have to say, when I first wrote this presentation, it clocked in at over 2 hours. And I know we couldn't be here for 2 hours, so I did have to cut a lot of things. I actually would have liked to spend a lot more time on like the 80s. And I just did not have that time, the time. But thank you so much for pointing that out, because now I want to go and research more of that. So there's so much that I couldn't get to today, but thank you.
oh man, I know. I could sense the energy that you were trying to like keep it
Fit
restrained.
everything in. Yes.
Yeah, right. I know it's my fault. Okay, Yvonne, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I gave Grace a very strict deadline of 50 minutes, and I'm pleased to say she stuck to it, but your interests were sacrificed as a result. Okay, Yvonne is back at it with another question. Have you played Pentiment? Probably the most typography aware game I've come across in the recent years. When scribes speak, oh my God, I want this game. When
Yes.
scribes speak, you can see elegant, well ligatured letters written with a reed pen.
Mhm.
When printers talk, oh my God, this game is for me. Okay,
Yeah.
Yvonne, thank you for recommending this. When printers talk, their type is set upside down and impressed. It is not. People of low social backgrounds speak in awkward scribbles that are quickly transformed into something more legible for the benefit of the player. Black letter for Germans, Roman type for
Mhm.
Italians, etc. Okay, woo!
Yeah. Thank you again for this. So I'm this has been on my list to play for so long. It came out I want to say a year ago, maybe. It's relatively recent, I believe. And it is one of the ones that I had to cut from this presentation. I'm so sorry. But thank you so much for bringing it up, because you're not the only one to suggest this game to me, and it's been on my list for so long that I think I'm going to bump it up to the top of the queue, because I keep getting recommended it to me, and for the reasons that you mentioned here. It's just like it. People say it also reminds them of Disco Elysium in a way. Not that it necessarily deals with like the same sort of subject matter or same sort of, the typography doesn't look the same, but in the fact that it's self-aware in the ways that you mentioned. So I'm going to have to move it to the top of my list, because it sounds amazing. But that's one of the reasons I cut it from the presentation, is because I didn't have time to play it before I gave this
Oh,
talk, and I didn't want to talk about something I didn't know. I obviously didn't get to play some of those like really old arcade games that I talked about, but the ones I spoke about from the early 2000s onward are all games that like I own or have played myself in some fashion. So that's why I didn't mention that one, but that is a great game, highly recommended. It's come highly recommended to me by multiple people.
Well, it sounds fantastic. Thank you, Yvonne, for the recommendation. I'm not a gamer personally, but that sounds right up my alley. Okay, David Jones asks, when is your book coming out? Ah,
Oh my gosh. I do a lot of what you saw today were just like my own interest and like private writings on things. And as I mentioned, like I've had to kind of cut a lot of from the presentation today to fit it in the time. I would love to publish a book, but I'd like to contact a lot of the people who worked on the games I spoke of and like speak to them. And I've actually not in a creepy way, but I've managed to find the email address for Simago, the Swedish developer, and I would love to email them and talk to them about the typography that's in their game, just as an example. It's on the emails on their website. I didn't mean to make it sound like I was a stalker at all, but I want to contact them and ask them about, you know, how they approach type in their games because their games are very wildly stylistically different, but type is definitely a focus in all of them. So yeah, I would love to publish a book at some point in the future.
I think you should, man. I mean, you have so much information here. I mean, the thing is, though, a lot of it is interactive, right? So it'd have to be
I
some kind of
know.
publication that
Yeah.
allowed for that,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and by the way, I did mention it before, but I love your headphones with the bunny ears.
Yes.
So cute.
It's my gaming headset, so I obviously had to wear it today.
Uh, right? Are you in a gamer chair also?
I am. So
Yes.
I play a lot of Overwatch. That's actually one of my if anyone knows that game in the presentation right now. I didn't talk about it, but it's probably like one of my most played games and am a diva main for anyone who plays Overwatch. So um yeah, that's what the gaming chair is.
Got it. Um, okay, let's see. Isabel Edmed asks, have you ever looked at a game's typography and felt it didn't match everything else the game presented? And then David Jones adds like Futura condensed in the menus of Skyrim.
Yes,
Hmm.
I definitely have. And I don't want to like bash any games or anything like that. So I don't really think I'll be mentioning any names, but I definitely have, and I've definitely felt like disappointment when I sometimes boot up a game, and maybe the title mark is really cool, but then the rest of the type in the game feels like you're like, what? I've definitely seen like Papyrus again, not bashing Papyrus, but we all know it as like a joke, you know. I'm thinking of like the SNL skit, right? But I've seen like fonts like that used and even in so the example I showed with that 2004 game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, um a lot of those fonts I I recognize from like the default fonts that were on my computer in like the early like 2000s, right? Um like it's really clear. One of my favorite stories too that I didn't get to mention earlier, but in BioShock, the game that I talked about after the vampire game, there is a section in a particular level where if you are it's set in this like garden level, right? So there's really there's plants everywhere. It's very green. The type sort of reflects that, but there's a particular sign where the text is stretched like Arial, right? And so it's stretched to fit the shape of the sign, and it's supposed to be this like Art Nouveau font style. And the developers have come out and said like we accidentally left this in because it was a placeholder at the time. They've never sort of gone back and patched it, but it's like stretched Arial font, which just makes me laugh. And you can go and see it in the game right now. It's in the Neptune's Bounty level if anyone's familiar with BioShock. But it's funny because they talk about it and it's like this like super ugly sign in the midst of all this like beautiful like typography. But yeah, so that's definitely one instance, although it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it definitely did not match what the game was presenting in that case.
That's pretty amazing because the BioShock game is pretty much on point as far as I
Yeah,
can tell of the period they're trying to.
absolutely.
I mean, I haven't
Yes.
played the game, but I do know some gamers and they my partner is a big gamer, and he shared that game with me because he knew I would go crazy over the
Hmm.
typography in it. But I don't, he didn't point that one out to me. So now I'm going to have to ask him to let me see that.
Yeah,
Because
it's
it
sort
sounds
of
like a mistake, like they
it,
screwed
it
up.
is. It definitely was. It was a mistake. They meant to, my understanding is that they meant to, and you can find this interview. It's like from the 2000, it's like from like right after the game came out. Um, but it's this like old interview with them that I managed to find, and they talk about how like they it just got shipped that way and they've just sort of left it in. But it's like a random sign in the this level, but it's pretty prominent. Once you find it, you can see it and you're like, oh my God, now I can't unsee it. And I think any designers who have played that game, I'm curious if you noticed it organically. I played the game back in 2007, so like when I was like a kid still basically. So I didn't notice it then, but when I've gone back and played it, I've definitely noticed it. So
Well, I see that even though you haven't really mentioned any games besides that one, people in the chat are calling out games with interesting typography. Um, Anyways, let's go to the next one. Teresa Lung asks, or Long, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, what is your favorite typeface or favorite three typefaces for whatever reason and why? Ooh.
how do I answer that?
I
Oh my
know, glad
gosh.
no one asked me that.
Oh
Whoa.
my gosh. Okay. Okay, just to kind of like narrow the list. This is like when someone asks what your favorite like food is or your favorite book, and like your mind instantly goes blank. I have now instantly forgotten every single typeface that I know. So I'm gonna stick with the ones in the presentation that I talked about today just to kind of give myself parameters because I need those. So I would say the Sky Fox game that I showcased from the early 70s and 80s from arcade game typography because I love again the ornateness of that font is so like misfitting to me against the like science fictionness of Skyfox. But that's again my favorite entry in arcade game typography, and I actually have arcade game typography sitting next to me at like any given time, and you can see how much I've read this book because it's I'm wearing out the cover. Um, but I would definitely say that is one of my favorites from the presentation I gave today because it's just so like weirdly beautiful and like funky. So I would say that one. I would say, let's see, I feel like I've talked about a lot of these ones already, but the fonts that are in BioShock, the Art Nouveau 1960s fonts that they find, and that the way they've managed to adapt, again, things that like, like Broadway is pretty commonly used, I think, in that game, but they've managed to like adapt it in a really beautiful way. Um, and then, of course, I would again say probably a tie between Persona 5 and Control. Control because it's very like no nonsense. It's sans serif, and I come from a university that is very brutalist. So UIC is a very brutalist campus, and so when I play Control, I feel like I'm almost playing a game that's set on my university campus. But I love the attention to detail that they took with the type in that game, and that's like not flashy type, right? It's avant-garde Gothic, which has its own personality, but it's not the Persona 5 level of like funkiness, right? But yeah, so I would say those ones out of the ones I presented today, just to kind of again give myself parameters. Otherwise, we would be here all day. So
Now that reminds me, once I went to a metal festival and some random dude came up and was like, "Well, what's your favorite band that you're coming here to see?" And I just went totally blank.
totally
And
blank.
I ended up saying Twisted Sister because it was the first band that came to my mind. I actually did not even care to watch Twisted Sister, but it was just too ridiculous. It's like
Yeah.
that,
Yes.
whenever
So
somebody asks you on the spot, you just like deer in the headlights.
yeah.
I've been there. Okay, let's see. So Terry already asked about Pentiment, so we're not going to talk about that. But we are going to ask Terry's replacement question, which is what ground do you feel still needs to be broken in gaming typography?
Yes, this is a great question, and it actually gets to something I didn't get to talk about, which is, and I sort of mentioned already, but type in augmented and virtual reality. So I would say, and so when I was in grad school, I got to work a lot with a faculty member named Daria Supakova, who actually heads our computer science and design program. It's a new degree that UIC just started to sort of integrate design with computer science. And so she does a lot of work in virtual reality, augmented reality. And I would say that's where we need to start thinking about typography way more. When you're in virtual reality, right, you are the world around you. It's 360 degrees. Um, there's no like overlay, like everything is like the world, right? And so what we see, if we treat type the same way that we do with like other digital media or like the way it's been treated in other video games, even it gets really funky. It overlays with each other. It makes it really unreadable. And so we think we need to think about like, okay, is type fading in and out as you get closer to an object versus when you're farther away from it? Is it growing smaller or bigger? There's a lot more like interactive, like kineticism of type that we need to think about in these types of spaces. VR is getting pretty big now. It's still not quite there yet. I feel like we're sort of still in the infant stages of it. Even though we've got, a lot of headsets, they're becoming smaller and lighter. I do a lot of augmented reality work with my classes, actually. So I teach digital media at UIC. I actually have a project that I base on arcade game typography. We make pixel type and then we set it in augmented reality and make it interactive. Um, but one of the things that the students have to think about are, you know, how is this going to look if the letter forms have physical weight and mass in augmented reality? So those are the things that I think we need to start thinking about now. If VR, or I should say, when VR and AR and extended realities become more and more prominent.
Awesome. Okay, we've got time for just a couple more questions. Let's see. And we do have four more left, so we're probably not going to get to all of them. So upvote the next one you want to see, guys. Okay. Ludovica asked, did you have a chance to research type? Oh, this seems like what you just said. So we can
Yep, I
pass
was
that
just
one
going
up.
to say, I think I
Okay,
just answered this question, but
you
I
did.
absolutely agree.
Yes. Okay. So now we have a question from Rad who says, have you ever seen the intro to Prey 2017 by Arcane Studios? It has some interesting 3D type integrated into the game world itself. One of my favorite type instances in games, besides Persona 5, of course.
Yes, another Persona 5 fan. I love Prey. I think it's such an underrated game. It got cut from the presentation. I'm so glad that everyone's like suggesting these games because I'm like, I was going to talk about that. But Prey is amazing, and I actually like love horror games. And I didn't get to talk about any of them today, but that's actually like my like super special gaming interest is horror games. It does have amazing 3D typography integrated in the world, as Red is saying. I highly recommend that if anyone's like been interested in this topic, that's another great one to check out. Thank you for the shout out for Prey.
Awesome. Okay, we might knock these all down. Let's see. David Santana asks, have you seen or heard of any heavily text-based work made for the professional esports scene of gaming?
Hi, David. David, I believe it's the same David Santana. He's one of my students from UIC. So actually, this is so funny. I keep saying this, but esports was a section I was going to talk about, and I again had to cut it. But esports is really interesting because a lot of the typography and the design of esports sort of is copied directly from like how we see modern day regular sports talked about. And I actually think that that is kind of a mistake. I think that we lose a lot of the identity of what makes esports really special when we sort of just like directly translate the design of, how we present like the players and the game matches as if we're presenting like regular sports game, like a basketball or a football game. And so I want to look more into that because that's just been my general impression. I follow Overwatch esports and League of Legends esports. I play League of Legends very, very badly. But I do like to follow like not super closely, but I do follow them. And that's been my impression is that it feels like the design just got sort of translated from like we're presenting a football or a basketball game to we're presenting a video game. Um, and I'm curious if that is going to evolve as esports becomes more popular, especially in America, right? I think esports is globally very popular, especially in like Asia. I know the Middle East is getting a pretty big gaming scene now, or esports scene. And it's slowly gaining ground in America. We have esports stadiums out in California now, I believe. Like Overwatch just restructured their whole league to be a different format, but they're currently in the midst of their championship series right now. Um, so I think the opportunity to create something like a new visual language for esports is definitely there. And I think it's a mistake that it sort of seems so far to me to be taking just directly from sports. I need to look more into that though. And that's actually like one of my future focuses. I would love to like analyze that and see what's out there. That's a great question. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'm sorry to say that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for joining us, Grace. This was amazing presentation. And thank you everybody for signing on with this lecture as well. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for Endangered Alphabets by Tim
Yeah.
Brooks.
I'll just say I see someone asking how to contact me.
Oh,
You can Google my name and you can find my work email address. I'm sorry, I should have put a slide at the end and I did not do that. But you can just Google my name and find my email address at the UIC website.
okay, that's a great tip. Do you have it handy? You can just drop it in the chat
Oh,
right
yeah, I can drop it in
now.
chat.
And
Let
then
me do that.
we got to sign off.
Okay,
But
it's
yeah, contact in the chat, people, because you'll all get a copy of the chat when you get a copy of the video after the presentation. Awesome. Thank you so much.
thank
Have
you,
a
everyone. Thank you so
wonderful
much.
rest of your day, everybody. Ciao.